so you want to own an ice company. It's 1806. There is no refrigeration anywhere on Earth. And you've just decided your business is going to cut frozen blocks out of a Massachusetts pond, load them onto a ship and sail them to the Caribbean, where the average temperature never drops below 80 degrees. Everyone who hears the plan thinks it's insane. A newspaper mocks it in print. And the man behind it, a 23-year-old named Frederic Tudor, is about to lose almost everything trying to prove them wrong. This is the real economics of the ice trade. A business built on selling something that, by definition, disappears the moment it succeeds. We'll cover what it actually costs to build this industry from nothing, how a business survives years of failure before finding a working model, and why one of the most successful trade goods of the entire 19th century eventually vanished almost completely. Let's get into it. Every business on this channel has some kind of built-in risk. This one has a risk baked directly into the product itself. Ice melts. That's not a rare failure mode. That's the default outcome of every single shipment. From the moment it's cut until the moment it's sold. Frederic Tudor's entire idea was to harvest ice from frozen New England ponds in winter, when it was, for a few short months, completely free, and sell it in places that had never had access to ice at all. First the Caribbean, later the American South, and eventually, astonishingly, India. The core economic problem was simple to state and brutally hard to solve. How do you transport a product that actively destroys itself? The entire time it's in your possession, across thousands of miles of open ocean, through tropical heat, and still have enough of it left at the other end to sell for a profit. Nobody had solved this at scale before. Tudor didn't just need a shipping business. He needed to invent an entire supply chain, an entire set of insulation techniques, and an entire market that didn't yet exist, all at the same time, with his own money on the line. Compare that to almost every other business we've covered on this channel. A miller's product doesn't vanish while he's selling it. A tavern's food spoils eventually, but not within days of preparation. Ice was uniquely, structurally hostile to the idea of storing inventory and waiting for the right buyer. Every single day of delay was a direct, measurable loss, whether the ice was sitting in a warehouse or still on the ship. That single fact shaped literally every other decision in this business, from where the harvest happened to how fast a ship needed to sail. In 1806, Tudor loaded a ship called the Favorite with ice cut from a pond near Boston and sailed for Martinique in the Caribbean. He'd secured no buyer in advance, built no proper storage facility on the other end, and had almost no experience with how fast ice actually melted in tropical conditions. Predictably, it went badly. A large share of the cargo melted before it could even be unloaded. And what did survive had nowhere proper to be stored once it reached shore. So it kept melting there too. Local merchants had no idea what to do with the product or how to use it. The voyage lost money and lost a lot of it. Most people would have stopped there. Tudor didn't. Over the following years, he kept refining the operation. Better insulated storage, buildings on the receiving end, better packing methods using sawdust as insulation between blocks of ice, and slowly, patiently, building actual demand in ports that had simply never had access to ice before, by giving away free samples to bars and households just to create the habit. It took years of losses before the business turned a real sustainable profit. At one low point, Tudor was actually imprisoned for unpaid debts tied directly to the ice trade, a detail that makes the eventual scale of his later success genuinely remarkable. What kept him going, by most historical accounts, was a stubborn conviction that the fundamental idea was sound, and that the failures so far were failures of execution, not failures of the concept itself. Each voyage taught him something concrete. How much ice actually survived a given number of days at sea. How sawdust packed at different thicknesses changed the melt rate. How a poorly built storage shed could undo weeks of careful shipping. He was, in effect, running a long, expensive, real-world research and development program funded almost entirely out of his own repeated losses. So what did it actually cost to get into this business once the model started working? First, harvesting rights or land access to a pond with clean, thick freezing ice, ideally close enough to a port that transport to the ship was fast and cheap. Then labor, and a lot of it, concentrated into a very short seasonal window. Ice had to be cut in large uniform blocks, which for years meant backbreaking manual, sawing through frozen water in the dead of winter. That changed significantly when a man named Nathaniel Wyeth, working with Tudor, invented a horse-drawn ice-cutting plow that could score the ice into perfectly, even grid lines far faster than hand-sawing, dramatically cutting labor, costs, and letting a crew harvest enormous quantities of ice in a fraction of the time. Then storage, enormous insulated ice houses, both at the harvesting site and at the destination port, using thick walls and packed sawdust as insulation to slow melting during the months the ice might sit waiting for buyers. These structures were a serious capital investment on their own, and getting the insulation design wrong meant losing product no matter how well the harvest and shipping had gone. Then shipping, especially arranged cargo space, packed with sawdust insulation between and around the ice blocks, on ships making a long, hot voyage where every additional day at sea meant more melted product and less to sell. Add labor, land access, tools, insulated construction, and shipping costs together. And this was a genuinely capital-intensive operation before a single block of ice had actually been sold to a paying customer. And nearly all of this cost was front-loaded into a brutally short window. Ice could only be harvested for a handful of weeks each winter, whenever a pond froze thick enough to cut safely, which meant an entire year's supply of inventory had to be produced, stored, and prepared for shipping in a single compressed burst of activity. Miss that window or get a mild winter with thin ice, and there was simply no way to make up the shortfall later in the year. The rest of the calendar was spent managing storage, arranging shipping, and waiting for the next freeze. Here's what made this business genuinely different from almost anything else covered on this channel. Tudor wasn't just selling a product. He was creating an entirely new category of demand in markets that had functioned perfectly well without it. For their entire existence, in the Caribbean and the American South, ice quickly became a luxury status symbol before it, became a practical necessity, used to chill drinks for wealthy households, and gradually adopted by bars, hotels, and eventually hospitals for both comfort and legitimate medical use. Tudor's strategy leaned heavily on this. He'd essentially seed the market with free or cheap ice to build a habit, then raise prices once demand and dependence were firmly established. And then, in one of the boldest moves in the entire history of this trade, Tudor and his business partners expanded the operation all the way to Calcutta, in British-controlled India. In 1833, a voyage of roughly 4 months across, open ocean through the tropics, delivering ice that had started as frozen pond water in Massachusetts to one of the hottest cities on Earth. That shipment, against enormous odds, actually arrived with a usable quantity of ice intact, and it was, by most accounts, a genuine sensation. It opened an entirely new international market and proved that with the right insulation and shipping techniques, this business could scale to almost any distance, however implausible that sounded on paper. The Calcutta success also did something less obvious but arguably just as important. It turned Boston Ice into a recognized, trusted brand name in markets, thousands of miles from where it was actually harvested. Buyers who'd never seen a frozen New England pond in their lives came to associate a specific origin with quality and reliability, in much the same way a modern consumer might trust a specific brand over an unfamiliar generic alternative. That brand trust let Tudor and the merchants who followed him command better prices than an unknown competitor, trying to break into the same market from scratch. The most obvious risk in this business was the one built into the product itself. Every single shipment was, from the moment of harvest, in a race against time and temperature, a slow voyage, a warm winter that produced thinner ice, a poorly sealed storage building, or simple bad luck with weather could turn a profitable cargo into a devastating loss almost overnight. And a warm winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an existential threat to the entire year's supply. If New England ponds didn't freeze thick enough, there was simply no substitute. Source of product available anywhere, close to the same price. The entire harvest for the year depended on weather. Nobody could control or predict with any real accuracy. Competition arrived quickly once the model proved viable. Other harvesters and shippers saw Tudor's success and moved into the same ponds and the same shipping routes, driving down prices in markets that had, only a few years earlier, never had access to ice at all. And there was a slower, more existential risk waiting further down the road, one that ultimately ended this entire industry: mechanical refrigeration. Once reliable ice-making machines and later true refrigeration technology matured in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the entire economic logic of shipping natural ice thousands of miles across open ocean simply stopped making sense. A business built on cutting frozen ponds in New England couldn't compete with a machine that could manufacture ice on demand, anywhere, regardless of the weather that particular winter. It's worth sitting with how total that shift eventually was: an entire seasonal labor industry, an entire fleet of specialized shipping arrangements, and an entire network of insulated ice houses, stretching from Massachusetts to India, were all built around a natural resource that a machine eventually made unnecessary almost everywhere at once. Within a few decades of reliable mechanical refrigeration becoming available, the natural ice trade that Tudor had spent his life building went from a major international industry to a historical footnote. So, was owning an ice company actually a good business? For years after that disastrous first voyage, the honest answer was clearly no. Tudor lost money repeatedly, went into serious debt, and was, for a period, literally imprisoned over it. But once the insulation techniques, the packing methods, the icehouse designs, and the market itself had all been properly developed, the business became genuinely, remarkably profitable. Tudor eventually became known as the Ice King, and by the time the industry reached its peak in the mid-1800s, natural ice harvested from New England ponds was being shipped, not just to the Caribbean and India, but to ports around the world, supporting an enormous seasonal labor industry back home in Massachusetts. The lesson embedded in this business is a little different from most of the others we've covered. This wasn't primarily a story about monopoly rights, or forced customers, or inherited risk between owner and worker. It was a story about a market that simply didn't exist yet, built from nothing through years of expensive failure, before it eventually became one of the more lucrative trade goods of the 19th century, right up until the technology that had made it necessary in the first place made it obsolete. By the industry's peak, ice harvesting employed thousands of seasonal workers across New England, supported an entire secondary industry of insulated icehouse construction, and shipped product to ports on nearly every continent. It's easy to forget, looking at that scale, that the whole thing nearly died in its very first year, on a single failed voyage to Martinique, that lost money and very nearly convinced Tudor to walk away from the idea entirely. So, back to the original question. Was owning a 19th century ice company a brilliant business, or an absurd gamble that happened to pay off? Based on everything we've covered, the honest answer is that it was both, in sequence. Years of absurd, expensive failure, followed by a genuinely brilliant, category-creating business once the fundamentals were finally solved. Frederic Tudor risked ruin, went into real debt, and by most accounts nearly gave up, entirely before this business became one of the defining trade stories of the era. It's a reminder that some of history's most successful ventures didn't start out looking smart at all. They started out looking like exactly the kind of idea a newspaper would mock in print, right up until it worked. And it's worth remembering how completely this entire industry eventually disappeared. Not through mismanagement or exhausted resources, but simply because a better technology made the whole premise unnecessary. That's a different kind of ending than most of the businesses we've covered on this channel, and maybe a more honest warning for any business built around solving a problem that a future invention might simply erase. If you enjoyed this breakdown, there's a lot more history hiding behind the numbers of industries people assume they already understand. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering what these ventures actually cost, who actually profited, and who actually paid the price. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.